The house was quiet, almost too quiet for David's liking. It had been that way since his mother's passing 6 months ago. He'd inherited the place, a quaint home in the suburbs, full of memories he wasn't ready to confront. It was a quiet neighborhood where not much happened, and that suited him just fine. His only company now was Max, his German shepherd, who had been with him for years, loyal and protective. Max had always been a calm dog, obedient, reliable. His steady presence was one of the few things that kept David grounded after his mother's death. The two of them had fallen into a comfortable routine: long walks in the morning, afternoons working from home, and quiet evenings in front of the TV. But recently, something had changed. It started one afternoon, while David was working on his laptop. Max, who usually napped quietly by his side, suddenly jumped to his feet and bolted toward the front door. The barking that followed was loud and urgent, something David hadn't heard from him before. "Max, what's going on?" David called from his desk, confused by the sudden outburst. Max was at the door, barking non-stop, his body tense as if ready to pounce. David stood up and walked over, peeking through the window next to the door. There was a man standing at the gate, tall, dressed in a long coat, with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was just standing there, looking toward the house. "Max, quiet!" David commanded, trying to calm the dog. But Max didn't stop. His barking became more frantic, his growls low and guttural. David opened the door just a crack, holding Max back by his collar. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to sound composed, though Max's unusual behavior had put him on edge. The man at the gate didn't move closer, didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, watching the house, his expression difficult to read. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice low and almost unsettling. "I knew your mother." David's heart skipped a beat. "You knew my mother?" He hadn't heard that name mentioned by anyone outside his immediate family in months. The man nodded but offered no further explanation. "Look, if this is some kind of sales pitch..." "No," the man interrupted. "I'm not here for that. I just wanted to see the house, your mother's house." David was about to ask more, but Max's barking had escalated. The dog was almost pulling out of his grip, desperately trying to get to the man. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Max was acting. This wasn't just protective behavior. It was as if the dog was warning him about something. "I think it's best you leave," David said, closing the door halfway, his grip tightening on Max's collar. The man looked like he might argue, but then he glanced down at Max, and for the briefest moment, his calm demeanor shifted. There was a flicker of something, nervousness, fear. He took a step back. "I'll come back," the man said, before turning and walking away, disappearing down the quiet street. David closed the door, exhaling slowly as he released his grip on Max. The dog finally stopped barking, but remained tense, pacing near the door with a low growl still rumbling in his throat. "What was that all about?" David muttered to himself, watching Max. The dog had never reacted like that before, not even toward strangers on their walks. He was well-trained, composed. Something about that man had unsettled him deeply, and David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Max finally settled back down, though his ears remained perked up, still alert. David sat down on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. Who was that man, and why did Max react like that? He glanced over at a picture on the mantelpiece, his mother smiling in front of the very same house, Max at her feet as a puppy. She had lived here for decades, long before David had moved back to take care of her. And yet, in all those years, she had never mentioned a man like that. David felt a knot of unease in his stomach. The stranger's visit had stirred something in Max, and now it was beginning to stir something in him too. That night, long after the house had gone dark, and David had gone to bed, Max remained by the front door, his body still tense, his eyes watching the shadows outside. David had always trusted his dog's instincts, but now, more than ever, he wondered if Max was seeing something that he couldn't. The next day, David couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. Max had been restless all night, and even now, as the morning light filled the house, the dog remained alert, his eyes constantly drifting toward the front door. It was as if he was waiting for something, or someone. David tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept wandering back to the stranger from yesterday. The man had appeared out of nowhere, offering nothing but vague words about knowing his mother. The whole interaction had been unsettling, and Max's behavior only added to the tension. Around midday, there was a knock at the door. David's heart skipped a beat. Max was on his feet instantly, barking furiously, just like he had the day before. David hesitated, his hand hovering over the keyboard as the knocks came again. This time, louder, more insistent. Slowly, David stood up and walked toward the door. Max was already there, his body tense and low, growling as if ready to spring at whatever was on the other side. David peered through the window beside the door, and there he was, the same man, standing at the gate, just as he had the day before. David's pulse quickened. He opened the door a crack, holding Max by the collar again. "I thought I told you to leave," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't move closer, his eyes locked on David with that same unreadable expression. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said calmly. "I just want to talk." Max's barking grew louder, more aggressive. David could feel the tension in the dog's body, every muscle coiled and ready to react. There was something about the man that set Max off in a way David had never seen before. "I don't know who you are or what you want," David said, "but my dog clearly doesn't trust you, and neither do I." The man's gaze shifted from David to Max, and once again that flicker of nervousness crossed his face. He took a step back, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of surrender. "I understand, but please. I knew your mother. I have things I need to explain." David's grip tightened on Max's collar, trying to keep the dog from lunging. "My mother never mentioned you," he said, his tone sharp. "If you have something to say, make it quick." The man hesitated, glancing around as if making sure they were alone. "Your mother and I, we were close once, a long time ago. I'm not here to cause trouble, I swear. I just need you to know that. There are things about her past you don't know, things she kept hidden." David felt a chill run down his spine. He had always believed he knew everything about his mother, especially after moving back home to take care of her in her final years. But now this stranger was suggesting otherwise. "What kind of things?" David asked, his voice low. The man looked like he was about to answer when Max's growls grew louder, almost frantic. David could barely hold him back now. It was as if the dog could sense something dangerous in the air, something David couldn't see. I can't explain everything right now," the man said, backing away a few steps. "But I'll come back. There are things you need to know." Before David could respond, the man turned and walked quickly down the street, disappearing around the corner. Max continued to bark until the man was completely out of sight, and even then he stayed by the door, his body still rigid with tension. David closed the door, his mind racing. What had just happened? Who was this man, and why had his mother never mentioned him? And more importantly, why was Max reacting so violently to him? David sat down on the couch, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process everything. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the man had spoken, as if he was hiding more than he was revealing. And then there was Max, his loyal, calm dog who had never shown this kind of aggression before. David glanced at Max, who was now pacing in front of the door, still growling softly under his breath. Whatever this stranger had come to say, it had triggered something primal in the dog. Something that David couldn't understand. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. David couldn't concentrate on his work, and every time he tried to settle into his routine, his mind drifted back to the man's words. "There are things about her past you don't know." What could his mother have possibly hidden from him? That night, as David lay in bed, sleep eluded him. Max lay by the front door again, keeping watch. The house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt strange and uneasy, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. David knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The man would come back, and when he did, David would have to be ready for whatever truth was about to unfold. The following days were filled with unease. David went through the motions of his daily routine, but everything felt different, off somehow. Max remained on edge, his usual calm demeanor replaced by constant vigilance. Every time there was a sound outside or a car passed by, the dog would jump to his feet, growling lowly and pacing near the door. It was like he was waiting for the man to return. David tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the stranger's words. "There are things about her past you don't know." The statement gnawed at him, stirring memories he hadn't thought about in years. Had his mother really kept secrets from him? They had always been close, or at least, that's what he believed. After all, she had raised him on her own, and they had shared everything, or so he had thought. One afternoon, unable to concentrate any longer, David decided to dig through some of his mother's old things. Her belongings had been packed away after her death, and most of it remained untouched in the attic. David climbed the creaky stairs, feeling the cool, musty air of the attic surround him. Boxes lined the walls, each one filled with pieces of his mother's life. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Maybe a letter, a photograph, something that would explain who the stranger was and why he had appeared now, months after her death. David opened the first box, filled mostly with old photo albums. He flipped through the pages, seeing familiar faces from his childhood. His mother, always smiling, always so full of life. But there were also pictures he didn't recognize. A group of friends, some taken at parties and events from years ago. In one, his mother stood next to a man he didn't know, her arm casually draped over his shoulder. David's heart skipped a beat. Could this man be the stranger who had shown up at his door? The picture was old, faded at the edges. His mother looked younger, maybe in her late 20s, and the man next to her had the same tall frame and sharp features as the one who had been standing at his gate. But why had she never mentioned him? As David continued to search through the box, more questions surfaced. Had his mother lived a life he didn't know about? Had there been someone important to her that she had kept hidden from him? The idea seemed impossible. She had always been so open with him, or at least that's how it had seemed. Max, who had followed him up to the attic, was sitting quietly beside a stack of boxes, his eyes following David's every move. The dog seemed calmer now, as if sensing that David was close to finding something important. David put the photograph aside and kept digging. In one of the smaller boxes, he found a bundle of letters tied together with a ribbon. They were old, the paper yellowed with age. His mother's handwriting was scrawled across the front of each envelope, addressed to someone named James. David's pulse quickened. He didn't know anyone named James. Had his mother been writing to someone all these years without his knowledge? The letters were dated from decades ago, long before David was born. He untied the ribbon and carefully opened the first letter. The contents were brief but intimate, filled with words of affection and longing. His mother spoke of missing someone deeply, of dreams they had shared together. But there was also a tone of regret, as if something had come between them. The more David read, the more he realized that this man, James, had been a significant part of his mother's life, and yet she had never told him about it. Max let out a low whine, pulling David from his thoughts. He put the letters down, his mind spinning. This man, James, was likely the same person who had appeared at his gate, the same person his mother had cared for deeply, and yet had chosen to keep a secret. David felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, and sadness all swirling together. How could his mother have kept something like this from him? Had she thought he wouldn't understand, or was there something darker, more painful, that she hadn't wanted him to know? He glanced down at Max, who was now lying quietly by his feet. The dog had always been protective of him, always by his side. And now, David realized, Max had sensed something in the stranger that David hadn't. Something connected to his mother's past, to a part of her life that had remained hidden. David sat back on his heels, staring at the letters. There were still so many questions, so many things he didn't know. But one thing was certain. The stranger was no longer just a man from the past. He was part of a secret his mother had taken to her grave. David couldn't let the letters sit unanswered. The discovery of James, a name that had never come up in his life, yet so deeply intertwined with his mother's past, left him with more questions than he could handle. The air in the house felt heavier now, thick with untold stories and secrets long buried. Max seemed to sense it too. The dog had calmed since their attic visit, but his alertness never truly faded, as though he knew the man would return. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through the letters and the photograph he had found. The stranger at the gate? Was he James? If so, why had he waited until now to come? And what did he mean by, "There are things you don't know about her past"? The words echoed in his mind, demanding answers. The next morning, David made a decision. He needed to dig deeper. He couldn't just sit and wait for the man to come back. It was time to find out who James really was. His first instinct was to search through his mother's old documents, hoping for some legal clue or record. The attic had been a trove of memories, but there might be something more concrete in her personal papers. David went to the study, where his mother had kept important documents neatly filed away. Max followed closely behind, his ears perked up as if sensing David's determination. David spent hours combing through papers, bills, old tax forms, property deeds, but there was nothing unusual, nothing that mentioned a James. Frustrated but not deterred, David turned to the internet. He typed in James alongside his mother's name and searched, combing through social media, platforms, archives, anything that might lead to a clue. After an hour of dead ends, he found something, a small article from a local newspaper, dated nearly 30 years ago. The headline read, "Local couple involved in tragic accident. Woman survives, man disappears." David's breath caught as he saw his mother's name in the article. The report was vague, but it detailed a car accident that had taken place on a rural road. His mother had survived with minor injuries, but the man in the car with her, identified only as James, had gone missing after the crash. His body had never been found. David stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Could this be the same James? The man his mother had written to, the man who had seemingly vanished from her life. And if so, why hadn't she ever told him about the accident? Max let out a soft whine, nudging David's leg as if sensing his rising anxiety. David sat back, trying to process everything. His mother had been in an accident with James. He had disappeared, presumed dead, yet there were letters, photos, evidence that he had been a part of her life. What had really happened that night? David's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His heart jumped. Max was already at the door, barking fiercely, just as he had before. David felt a cold chill run down his spine. It had to be him, the stranger, James. David approached the door cautiously, Max still growling by his side. He peered through the window, and sure enough, there he was. Tall, shadowed by the evening light, standing at the gate just like before. David hesitated for a moment before opening the door a crack. "You need to leave," he said firmly, holding Max back by the collar. The man didn't move closer this time. His expression was more solemn, less guarded than before. "I told you I'd come back," he said quietly. "We need to talk." David was ready to shut the door, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the weight of everything he had discovered, the letters, the accident, the photograph. He needed answers, and this man, James, was the only one who could give them to him. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice tense. "What do you really want?" The man's eyes flickered, and he took a deep breath. "I'm James," he said simply. "The man your mother loved, the one who disappeared." David felt his stomach drop. He had expected the answer, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. "You can't be," David said, shaking his head. "She told me you were dead, the accident. She said you never came back." James looked down for a moment, his face hardening with old memories. "That's true in a way," he said. "I never came back to her, but I didn't die in that crash." David's grip tightened on Max's collar, unsure whether to believe him. Why now? Why show up all these years later? James glanced at Max, the dog still growling low, and then back at David. "I wasn't ready to come back before," he said. "There were things I needed to figure out on my own. But your mother, she kept writing to me, even when I didn't answer. And when she died, I realized I couldn't avoid it anymore. I needed to come back. I needed you to know the truth." David's mind was spinning. The truth? What truth? "What happened that night?" David asked, his voice hoarse. "The accident?" James sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as though trying to erase the memories. "It wasn't just an accident," he said finally. "There were complications, things I can't explain easily. But your mother, she wasn't just keeping secrets from you, she was keeping them from herself." David's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" "There's more to your family than you know," James said quietly. "More to your past, and if you're willing, I'll help you understand." David stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of James's words sinking in. More to your family than you know? His thoughts raced as he tried to process everything. Max, still tense and growling softly, paced beside him, ever watchful of James. David felt a mix of emotions: fear, confusion, even anger. But most of all, he felt betrayed by the secrets his mother had kept. He had believed that she had shared everything with him, but it seemed that her past was far more complicated than he had imagined. And now this man, James, supposedly dead, had returned to unravel the mystery. "I don't understand," David said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "What does my family have to do with any of this?" James glanced at Max again before speaking. "It's not just your family, it's also about him, the dog." David blinked, stunned by the sudden shift. "What, Max?" James nodded. "Yes, your mother's connection to him. It wasn't a coincidence." David looked down at Max, who was staring intensely at James, his eyes filled with something deeper than just aggression. There was something else there, an awareness, almost like the dog understood more than David did. It was unsettling. "What are you talking about?" David asked, more confused than ever. "Max is just a dog. My mother adopted him a few years ago," James interrupted, shaking his head. "No, Max wasn't just some random adoption. Your mother didn't tell you the full story." David's breath caught in his throat. He had always thought Max was just a loyal companion, but now James was suggesting that there was more to the dog than met the eye. "Max came to your mother at a time when she needed him most," James continued. "He wasn't like other dogs. He had instincts, abilities. He was connected to her in ways you wouldn't understand unless you knew the truth." David's heart pounded. "Abilities? What are you saying? Are you trying to tell me Max is special?" James sighed, his gaze softening. "Your mother never wanted to burden you with the details, but yes, Max has always had a heightened awareness. It's like he could sense things: danger, emotional turmoil, even people's intentions. That's why he's been reacting the way he has to me. He knows I'm tied to the secrets she kept from you." David stared at Max, his mind reeling. Could it be true? Could his loyal dog, the one who had been by his side through everything, be more than just a protector? Was he truly sensing things that David couldn't? "You're saying Max knows something?" David asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Yes," James replied. "He's been trying to protect you from the truth, just like your mother did. But now that she's gone, he's the only one left who remembers it all. And that's why he's been so agitated, because he knows that my presence is a threat to the world you thought you knew." David felt a chill run down his spine. Max, who had been by his side for years, was not just a companion, he was a guardian of secrets. Secrets that had remained buried with his mother, and now with the return of James, those secrets were starting to unravel. "I don't understand," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she ever mention any of this?" James' expression softened with sympathy. "Your mother loved you, David. She thought she was protecting you by keeping these things hidden. She didn't want you to carry the burden of her past or the truth about Max. But now that she's gone, it's up to you to decide what to do with it." David felt his hands tremble slightly as he tried to make sense of it all. He looked down at Max, who sat silently at his feet now, his intense eyes still fixed on James. The dog's loyalty had never been in question. But now, it seemed as though Max had been protecting more than just David's physical safety. He had been guarding the truth. "Max knew my mother's secrets?" David asked, still struggling to accept the reality that was unfolding. James nodded. "In a way, yes. He was more connected to her emotionally and spiritually than anyone else. That's why she kept him close. He helped her carry the weight of the past. But now, it's time for you to know the truth too." David felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. Everything he had known about his life, his family, and even his dog was being turned upside down. The safe, predictable world he had lived for so long was crumbling, and in its place was a web of mysteries he wasn't sure he was ready to untangle. "Why are you telling me this now?" David asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "Why didn't you come sooner?" James exhaled, his face showing the weariness of years spent in hiding. "I couldn't come back before. I wasn't ready to face everything that had happened. But now, with your mother gone, I realized it was time. You deserved to know the truth, about her, about me, and about Max." David stood in silence for a long moment, his mind spinning with questions. He had thought that his mother's death had been the end of her story, but now it seemed like it was just the beginning of something much larger. Max, sensing his inner turmoil, nudged David's hand gently. The touch was comforting, grounding him in the chaos of it all. David looked down at the dog, his faithful companion, and for the first time, he saw something in Max's eyes that he had never noticed before. A depth, a wisdom that seemed far beyond what any ordinary dog should possess. And in that moment, David knew that whatever came next, he couldn't turn back. David sat quietly for a moment, trying to absorb everything James had just told him. The revelation about Max, the idea that the dog had been guarding secrets, aware of things beyond David's comprehension, was almost too much to handle. But as bizarre as it sounded, David couldn't deny the intensity of Max's reactions and how deeply connected the dog seemed to be to his mother's hidden past. But there was still so much left unexplained. The accident, the letters, James's the mysterious disappearance, all of it swirled in David's mind like a storm, demanding answers. Max stayed by David's side, his presence a steady reminder of the truth that had been unearthed. James stood just outside the door, watching David with a mixture of sympathy and guilt. It was clear that the weight of the past had been just as heavy on him as it had been on David's mother. "You said there was more to my family's past," David said finally, his voice hoarse. "More than just Max. What did you mean by that?" James hesitated, glancing at Max before stepping closer to the door. "There's something you need to know about your mother, about what really happened the night of the accident." David's pulse quickened. The accident. The story he had been told was that it had been a tragic car crash. His mother had survived, but James had disappeared, presumed dead. But now David knew there was more to it. James took a deep breath, his face hardening as he prepared to reveal the truth. The accident wasn't just an accident, David. It was deliberate. David felt his stomach drop. What? What do you mean deliberate? "Your mother and we were being followed," James said, his voice low and steady. "That night, we were trying to leave town. We had decided to start a new life together, to leave behind the people who were after us. But they found us. They forced us off the road." David's heart raced as he listened, his mind struggling to make sense of the revelation. "Who was following you? Why?" James looked down, his expression darkening. "Your mother and I were involved with people. Powerful people who didn't take kindly to us trying to leave. She never told you because she didn't want you to be part of that world. She wanted you to have a normal life, away from all the danger." David's hands trembled. "Danger? What kind of danger are you talking about?" James' eyes met his, filled with regret. "It wasn't just business. There were things your mother and I were caught up in, things that put both of our lives at risk. After the accident, when they thought I was dead, I stayed hidden. I had to. If I had come back, they would have killed me. And they would have gone after her too." David felt a cold chill run through him. His mother, his loving, kind-hearted mother, had been involved in something dangerous, something that had almost cost both of them their lives. And she had kept it from him all these years. "She never told me," David whispered, his voice breaking. "She never said a word." "She didn't want to burden you with it," James said softly. "She thought she was protecting you by keeping it all hidden. That's why she never told you about me, about the accident, or about the people who were after us." David's mind was spinning, trying to piece together the fragments of his mother's hidden life. The accident hadn't been a tragic mistake. It had been an attack. And James, he had been forced to disappear to protect both of them. Max whined softly at David's side, sensing the tension in the air. David reached down and stroked the dog's fur, grateful for his presence. It was clear now that Max had always known something was wrong, even when David hadn't. "But why come back now?" David asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Why wait all these years to tell me this?" James hesitated, his expression conflicted. "I wasn't ready to face the past. After your mother died, I thought it was over. But then I realized you deserved to know the truth. I owed it to both of you." David shook his head, trying to make sense of everything. "And Max? What does he have to do with all of this?" "Your mother knew she couldn't protect you forever," James said. "That's why she brought Max into your life. He wasn't just any dog. He was trained to sense danger, to protect you when she couldn't. She trusted him to look after you, even when she was gone. David's breath caught in his throat. Max, his loyal, protective companion, had been more than just a pet. He had been a guardian, a protector assigned to him by his mother, to keep him safe from the shadows of her past. "That's why he's been acting this way," David murmured, his hand resting on Max's head. "He knows you're connected to all of this." James nodded. "He's been trying to protect you, just like your mother wanted. But now, with the truth out in the open, it's time for you to decide what to do next." David felt a lump form in his throat. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his mother, and even Max had been turned upside down. The safe, quiet life he had built for himself had been built on a foundation of lies, and now he was faced with the painful truth. "What do you expect me to do?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. James stepped forward, his expression serious. "You need to decide if you want to keep hiding from the past, or if you want to face it head on. The people who were after us, they're still out there. They may not know who you are yet, but if they find out..." David felt his blood run cold. The danger his mother had tried so hard to shield him from wasn't gone. It was still lurking, waiting to resurface. Max let out a low growl, as if sensing the weight of the decision David was about to make. David looked down at his dog, feeling the warmth of Max's steady presence beside him. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," David admitted, his voice shaking. James met his gaze, his expression softening. "No one's ever ready. But you have Max. He'll be with you, no matter what happens." David swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over him. The past had come back to haunt him, but this time, he wasn't facing it alone. David sat in silence, the weight of the revelation settling in his chest like a heavy stone. The truth had been laid bare, and with it, the carefully constructed version of his life had begun to crumble. His mother, the woman he had loved and trusted, had been living in the shadow of danger for years, hiding secrets that had kept him safe but ignorant. Now the past had come knocking, and David had no choice but to confront it. Max sat beside him, quiet now but still alert, his eyes watching every movement James made. The tension between them had lessened, but David could still feel the protective energy radiating from his dog. Max had been his constant companion, his guardian, in ways David hadn't even understood until now. James remained by the door, watching David with a mix of sympathy and expectation. He knew what David was grappling with, years of lies and half-truths, now unraveling into something much more dangerous. "You don't have to decide right now," James said softly, breaking the silence. "But you need to be prepared. The people who are after us may not know who you are yet, but if they find out..." David nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. His mother had protected him from this for so long, and now he was being forced into a world he had never wanted to be part of. Max nudged his leg, breaking his train of thought. David looked down at his dog, feeling a rush of gratitude. Through all of this, Max had been there, quietly guarding him, always ready to protect. And now, David realized, he wasn't just protecting him from physical threats. Max had been guarding him emotionally, helping him stay grounded even as the foundation of his life shifted beneath his feet. "You've been with me through everything, haven't you, boy?" David murmured, running a hand through Max's fur. The dog let out a soft whine, resting his head against David's knee. For the first time in days, David felt a sense of calm. The chaos swirling around him didn't feel so overwhelming with Max by his side. Whatever came next, whatever dangers might surface, David knew he wasn't facing it alone. James took a step forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Your mother trusted Max to keep you safe. She knew what she was doing when she brought him into your life. But now it's your turn to decide. Do you want to continue living in the dark, pretending none of this exists, or do you want to face the truth and protect yourself?" David looked up at James, his mind still swirling with questions. But in his heart, he knew the answer. The life he had known was gone. There was no going back to the days of quiet solitude, where the biggest concern had been his work and his peaceful routine. The truth was out now, and the only way forward was to confront it. "I'm not going to hide," David said finally, his voice steady. "I want to know everything. I want to understand what happened to my mother and why she kept this from me. I need to know the whole truth." James nodded as if he had been expecting that answer. "Then I'll tell you everything," he said. "But first, you need to be prepared. Once you step into this world, there's no going back." David glanced at Max, who was still sitting calmly by his side, and felt a surge of confidence. The dog had been there for him through every moment of doubt and confusion. Max had sensed the danger before David had even realized it existed, and now David knew that the dog would be with him through whatever came next. "I'm ready," David said, standing up from the couch. "Tell me what I need to do." James stepped closer, his face serious. "First, you need to understand that the people who were after your mother, they're still out there, and they're not just some random criminals. They're connected, powerful, and they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden." David's stomach tightened at the thought, but he remained resolute. "What do they want? Why were they after my mother?" James hesitated for a moment before answering. "Your mother and I were involved in something we shouldn't have been. It started as a business deal, something that seemed harmless at first, but it quickly turned into something else. We got in too deep, and by the time we realized the danger, it was too late." David's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of his mother's past. He had always known her as a kind, loving woman, dedicated to her family. The idea that she had been involved in something dangerous, something that had almost cost her life, was hard to reconcile with the image he had of her. "What kind of business deal?" David asked, his voice tense. James looked away, clearly struggling with the weight of the truth. "It wasn't just business. There were people, powerful people, who were using us. We didn't realize it at first, but by the time we did, we were trapped. Your mother tried to get out, but they wouldn't let her. That's why we tried to run. That's why the accident happened." David's chest tightened. The accident that had taken James from his mother's life, the one she had never spoken about, it had been no accident at all. It had been a deliberate attempt to silence them. Max growled softly, his eyes still locked on James. David could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken fear of what might come next. "How do we stop them?" David asked, his voice firm. James looked at him, a hint of respect in his eyes. "We don't stop them," he said quietly, "but we can protect ourselves. Your mother's secrets died with her, and as long as you stay quiet, they won't come for you. But if you dig too deep, if you try to expose them, they'll come after you, just like they came after her." David swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had come this far, uncovered so many truths, but now he faced a choice: dig deeper and risk everything, or stay silent and live with the knowledge that his mother had died, protecting secrets he would never fully understand. Max nuzzled his hand, grounding him in the moment. David took a deep breath, feeling the steady pulse of determination settle over him. "I need to know," David said, his voice calm but resolute. "I need to know everything." Weeks had passed since the night James had revealed the truth, but the weight of everything still lingered heavily on David's mind. The shock of discovering his mother's hidden life, the danger she had protected him from, and the reality of Max's role in all of it, it was still hard to fully comprehend. Yet, despite everything, David had begun to find some peace. The chaotic storm of revelations had slowly settled into a quiet understanding. He knew now that his mother had kept secrets not out of malice, but out of love, a desperate attempt to shield him from a world she had tried to escape. And in her absence, Max had become her silent guardian, always by David's side, ensuring that he was safe, both physically and emotionally. James had kept his word. Over the past few weeks, he had shared everything with David. The full extent of what had happened between him and David's mother, the dangerous people they had been entangled with, and the reason for the accident. It had been a painful process, but with each piece of the puzzle, David had started to see his mother in a new light. She wasn't just the warm, nurturing figure he had always known. She was also a survivor, a woman who had fought fiercely to protect her son from the darkness of her past. The house felt different now. The walls, once filled with memories of comfort and security, now carried the weight of untold stories. David often found himself sitting by the fireplace, staring at the old photo of his mother on the mantelpiece, reflecting on the life she had hidden from him. There was pain in that realization, but there was also pride, pride in knowing how far she had gone to keep him safe. Max had returned to his usual calm demeanor, though David couldn't help but see him differently now. The dog, who had been with him through thick and thin, was no longer just a loyal companion. Max was a protector, not only from physical danger, but from the emotional burdens David hadn't been ready to face. Every time David looked into his dog's eyes, he saw a depth that he hadn't noticed before, a wisdom that seemed to go beyond that of a normal animal. One evening, as David sat on the porch with Max by his side, watching the sun dip below the horizon, James appeared once more at the gate. This time, there was no tension, no uncertainty in the air. Max didn't growl or bark. Instead, he remained seated beside David, his head resting on David's knee, content and calm. James walked up to the porch, his expression softer than it had been the first time they'd met. "I see things have settled down," he said, nodding toward Max. "He seems at peace now." David smiled slightly, running a hand through Max's fur. "He's been through a lot. We both have." James nodded in understanding and sat down on the steps, his eyes gazing out at the darkening sky. "I wanted to check in," he said quietly, "to see how you've been holding up." David appreciated the gesture, though the past few weeks had given him time to reflect and heal. "It's been hard," David admitted, "but I think I'm finally starting to accept everything." James looked over at him, his face filled with empathy. "Your mother loved you more than anything, David. She did everything she could to protect you. She carried those secrets so you wouldn't have to." "I know," David said, his voice soft, "and I understand why she did it, but it doesn't make it any easier." James sighed, nodding. "No, it doesn't." For a while, they sat in silence, the cool evening breeze brushing past them. The tension that had once filled their interactions was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. James had come back to help David find the truth, and now that he had, there was a sense of closure between them. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," James said after a long pause. "I've decided to leave town. Now that everything's out in the open, there's nothing left for me here." David wasn't surprised. He had known that James' return had been temporary, that he had only come back to reveal the truth and then disappear again. Still, there was a part of David that felt an odd sense of loss. Despite everything, James had been a link to his mother, a final connection to a part of her life that had remained hidden for so long. "Where will you go?" David asked. James shrugged. "Someplace quiet, away from all of this. I've spent too many years running from the past. It's time I started over." David nodded, understanding the need for closure. "I hope you find peace, James." James smiled faintly. "I think I will, and I hope you do too." David looked down at Max, who was now dozing contentedly beside him. "I think we will." As the sun disappeared completely, leaving the sky a deep shade of indigo, James stood up, brushing the dust from his jeans. "Take care of yourself, David, and take care of Max. He's more important than you know." David stood as well, offering a firm handshake. "Thank you, James, for everything." James nodded one last time before turning and walking down the street, disappearing into the shadows just as he had so many years ago. David watched him go, a strange sense of finality settling over him. The secrets of the past had been uncovered. The dangers that had once loomed over him were now understood. But most importantly, he had found peace, not just with his mother's memory, but with the life she had built for him. That night, as David closed the door and turned off the lights, he felt lighter than he had in months. He walked over to the couch, where Max was already curled up, and sat down beside him. The dog lifted his head briefly, his eyes meeting David's with that familiar look of understanding, before laying his head back down. David smiled softly, his hand resting on Max's back. "We made it through, didn't we, boy?" Max let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping softly against the cushion. For the first time in what felt like forever, David wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. The past, with all its secrets and darkness, had been faced. The truth, as painful as it had been, had set him free. And now, with Max by his side, David knew that whatever came next, he would be ready.